welcome to the first video of the writing group. I'm Madison from the Rural Storytelling Project, and I'm here to help you all write great and interesting stories. So today we're actually going to be focusing on writing good characters and plots. These are sort of the fundamental structures of a story that the whole rest of the story is built upon. So we first want to talk about character, because I think the way to make a really interesting and engaging story that interacts with the audience and excites them is that you need to have a strong, interesting character. So the first thing that we need to talk about is point of view. I'm sure you've all heard about point of view, but I think it's important to discuss the voice which directs the story, because that affects how information is relayed to your audience by the voice that's guiding it. So I'm sure you've heard of first-person point of view, but that's when you use words like I and we. And this allows us the whole narration of the story to mimic the voice and the ideas of the main character. So you get to really dig deep into the character's mind, how they think, how they feel, how they interact with the world around them. So when the whole text is voiced by the protagonist, it's a little bit interesting because you get their bias, you get their perspective. If they don't like another character, whenever they're describing that character, their prejudices could influence how this other character is framed, and it affects how we read the character. So whenever you're reading a story in first person, or whenever you're writing a story in first person, you have to be aware that the voice that's directing the story is very biased. And that can create a lot of interesting outcomes because, stories are not objective. They are subjective. And so by directing it in the first person point of view, you're really acknowledging the subjective nature of the story. The nice thing about it also being in first person is it feels really authentic to read a story in the first person. We're learning about the character's experiences, and they're coming directly from that character. So you understand, it feels as though the relationship between the audience and the first person are very close to one another. The next type of point of view is second person POV, and this is when you use words like you and yours, so the reader of the text becomes the protagonist, and as the narrator, you get to control how your audience is expected to feel and behave in the text. Now this is a really interesting form of POV for a story, but I don't think it's one that's used as widely, because it's kind of used for an interesting effect. It's like you are talking directly to the reader, and you're controlling how they feel, how they respond to their environment. So you're really getting into the head of your reader. And now the last form of POV I want to talk about is the third person POV. So this is when you use terms like his or her or theirs. And so the narration is a little bit more removed from the protagonist. We're not directly in the protagonist's mind, but we still have a sense of their motivations, their driving forces, their traits, who they are as a character. But so there's two different types of third-person narration. There's omniscient, so the narrator can be aware of many characters' thoughts all at once. I kind of think of this one almost like godlike. Like they're sitting way above the narration, and they can understand the inner workings of all the characters' minds. And then the other version is third-person limited. Now you actually find that a lot of stories from like Harry Potter, they're like all told in third-person limited, because it's a really interesting way to write, because it's almost as if the narrator is sitting on the shoulder of the main character and going in and explaining their thoughts and motivations. But with this form of narration, there's a little bit less bias, because the narrator is allowed to sort of judge or draw conclusions from the protagonist's actions or the protagonist's way of thinking. So there's a little bit more freedom to be able to draw conclusions from the experiences of the first person. So I always like to think of changing up the POV of a text as a perfect cure for writer's block. I know that for me, sometimes if I'm getting really stuck in a story and say it's in like the first person, it might be helpful to write another scene in the third person, or even in the second person, because that allows us to dig a little deeper into our character's emotions, traits, their mind. It lets you see it gives you a new perspective on the character. So I always think the first step is, if you're ever in a story and you get stuck, I recommend trying to write at least one scene in a different POV, because I think that allows you a little bit more freedom. And so we've been talking a lot about characters, but what really is a character? What really is a good character? Because we know that characters are complex. We know that they're just like us. They're like humans in a way. So there's a lot in them. So sometimes it can be really hard to come up with a single definition for what a character is. But I like to think of these three main foundational aspects of a character that we can focus on. So the first one I like to point out is that characters have desires. They can have more than one desire, well, usually they do, or they could have one central driving desire that sort of explains their motivations. So characters have something that they want, or many things that they want, and these desires can be really large and complex ones, like love, revenge, respect. They could have giant career goals, or they could have simpler and material goals like brunch or shoes or new jobs. But I like to think of sometimes these material goals can give insight into the larger, more abstract, more philosophical goals. So say a character has just moved into a new house in a new town and doesn't have any friends in this new town, and maybe they want to adopt a new puppy, and this can sort of demonstrate that they are lonely and have this desire for closeness with others. Or say another character maybe really wants to buy this fancy locket that she sees in the store, but maybe the reason why she wants to buy this locket is because it reminds her of someone like her mother who might have passed away. So we can see that the character is driven for this want for this material good, but that it could also have this much larger implications for this sort of desire to connect with someone who's passed away. And so these are also sort of emotional responses to desires, and we're actually going to talk about that in a little bit too, because these desires can relate to the emotions and the traits to the characters, because we can kind of separate these three aspects of a character, but they all kind of play into one another. So the next one I'm going to talk about is that characters have traits. Traits are, unique to each character, and it could be a set of physical characteristics, or it could also be internal characteristics like their personality, what skills they have, sort of behaviors that are typical to them, sort of character tics. And I think the best way to talk about traits is to describe them, to show them, not to tell the audience about them. So one thing that you can kind of do that's interesting is if you want to show a physical characteristic, like let's say a character is really tall, instead of saying, oh, so-and-so is tall, you could have it so that every time he tries to walk into a building, he has to duck between the door frame because his head is too high up. Another thing that you can do to explain that is other characters that are in the scene always have to look up at this character because he's so tall. But you don't say that he's tall, you demonstrate that in scenes. And if you want to demonstrate something else like personality or behaviors, these internal characteristics, you can also do that by showing it. So let's set up a scene where a character's at a party, and you want to show that this one character is super greedy. So what you can do is you can show them going around and eating up all the cake and goodies and not saving any for anyone else. Or maybe there's presents around and this one character takes them all for himself. So you can see that he's a pretty greedy character, pretty selfish, but you don't tell the audience that. And the last point I want to hone in on is that characters have emotions. And so emotions are how the character responds to and reacts to the events that happen in the story. And this is really where you can see the individuality of the character come through, because different characters will respond to the same event in different ways, and these are motivated by their desires or traits. They will inform how the character responds to their environment. So I think that the best way to demonstrate emotions is by the character's actions, their thoughts. And so I think a good example of looking at this and seeing how characters can react to things differently is, let's say we have a character who's happy. Maybe this character who's happy will go and meet up with her friends, and they'll be talking in a scene together, and they're all laughing and making jokes. Now take another character who's happy, and what she does is she goes to the town and starts buying all sorts of goods. She goes on a big shopping spree. You see, they're experiencing the same general emotion of happiness, but it manifests itself in different ways. And this can give us insight into who the character is. The first character, who's hanging out with her friends, we see her as being very sociable. She values her relationships to one another. She has this desire to be around other people. She's funny. But the second character, we can kind of get a sense, maybe she's a little more material. Maybe she has a lot of money. Maybe she doesn't. Maybe she's not good with money. So we get a little different sense of who people are by the emotions that they demonstrate, the way that their emotions manifest. So I kind of think of making a character as like making a soup. So when you make like a chicken noodle soup, it has all different parts in it that all go together to make the soup. So you can have like the little carrots or vegetables and the chicken and the noodles. And you can look at these different aspects on their own, but they also contribute to something larger. So in this metaphor, the soup is the character, the whole entire thing, but we can look at the traits, the emotions, and the desires individually, and we can pick those out and sort of look at them and analyze them on their own, but also how they work together and contribute to a larger sense of who the character is. So if you're writing your story and you have come up with an interesting character that you want to write about, that's great and all, but we have to think about, what about the plot? So I like to think of plots as directly related to the character. A story is the arc of a character's journey, and stories are character-driven. Now what that means is that the events that happen are directly related to how they influence the character, because I think the way that stories work is that people connect with the characters, they connect and engage with the voice or the character that the story is following, and that's how stories build empathy. So when you're thinking about your plot, you want to always be thinking back to, who's my main character, what's going on with my main character, and how is every event that I'm talking about going to influence this character. And I would like to say also that plots have a simple skeleton. Plots don't need to be too complex. With time, you can make them a little bit more complex, you can add more details, you can fluff them up and make them more interesting, but at their very basis, they have a sort of simple structure that the story follows. I guess the last point is plots can be unique, but there are simple story structures that they can follow. So yeah, you can always take a sort of different idea and integrate it into your plot, but that very basis, that very root of the story is going to be a little bit simpler. And so I keep talking about this basic plot of the story, but what actually is it? Talk about stories. This is a Freon triangle, but basically it's the sort of theory that the story starts off with exposition. In the beginning, you learn about the character's background, then there's rising action. So what I like to think about this is, actually I think most stories follow most of what happens in the rising action. The climax tends to happen near the end, and the falling action is a bit of like a steep cliff, it falls very quickly and then goes to the conclusion. The way to look at this is, let's plot a story that we all know onto this map. So I'm going to be talking about Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, so if you have not, but we can start off by looking at the exposition. Harry is at Privet Drive with his aunt and uncle. We learn that he's not happy here, his emotional backstory in this moment, and then we also learn the backstory of his parents, that his parents passed away. Now the story moves into the rising action. Harry is able to go to Hogwarts. There's this big twist. The rising action sort of disrupts the normal. The exposition shows what's normal for Harry. It's normal that he lives at Privet Drive. And then there's something that happens in the rising action that causes tension and causes this normalcy to be super disrupted. So Harry now finds out he's a wizard, he goes to Hogwarts, and then along the way at Hogwarts there's lots of things that happen. I'm sure if you read the book, that's so exciting, there's so much going on. You know, he finds the three-headed dog, Fluffy. He finds the troll. He finds the Mirror of Erised. And so these are a bunch of different events that make Harry suspicious of his environment, suspicious of the teachers who go there, and worried that someone's going to try to steal what he ultimately finds out to be is the Sorcerer's Stone. And so this all leads up to the climax when Harry and his friends are going to that secret room and they fall underneath the school and have to face like the brooms flying around and the devil's snare and the giant chess pieces and finally Quirrell. And this is the final conflict of the story. It's where the climax happens and where it all builds. And so the next part after the climax is Harry begins to resolve this conflict when he defeats Quirrell and gets the Sorcerer's Stone. So like I said, the climax and the falling action are usually pretty much related, and the falling action is definitely a lot more brief than the rising action. That's typically. But there's obviously going to be stories that are a little bit different and stray away from this model. And then the last but not least, you get to the conclusion, the denouement, and Harry gets better in the hospital. He reflects on what he learned, the friendship and the bravery and the skills that he learned along the way. So that's basically a basic structure of a story. But I want to talk about another interesting concept that this writer, James Scott Bell, proposed, which is called the Doorways of No Return. So it's a focus on disturbances. Like I said before, when Harry starts off at the beginning at Privet Drive, that's his normal life. But a disturbance comes and it disrupts Harry's narrative arc. And what this writer calls is the doorways of no return, which means that Harry can't go back to that normal way of life. It's totally changed. He found out something totally different. He's a wizard. He can't just act like a normal boy in a normal British school anymore. He has to make this decision to live with the wizards and go to the wizard school, to go to Hogwarts. So this is an event that completely disrupted the character's emotions and motivated him to move either from the exposition to the rising action, so the beginning to the middle of the story, or from the rising action to the climax, so from the middle to the end of the story. But the fundamental thing about these disturbances, or these doorways of no return, is that they make a character have to make a decision. And how a character makes a decision is of course unique to that character. It's based on their traits, their desires. How they act is individual to that character. But these sort of moments, these external moments of doorways of no return, force the character to make a decision. So let's look at some examples in popular media to them. So if we look at all of what we've talked about today, we've talked about character and plot, and we talked about the voice that sort of describes these stories. So I definitely challenge you all to, next time you're writing a story, to keep these things in mind. That a character can be described by their desires, traits, and emotions, that there is a plot trajectory to the story with a beginning, middle, and an end that follows this sort of triangular structure, and that you want to be cognizant of the POV that you use in your story. What voice do you want to guide your story? So that's kind of a summary of what we talked about today. So I definitely challenge you all to write your own stories and keep these in mind. And definitely if you have any more suggestions for how to make a good character or a plot and you want people to know, I would definitely put them down in the comment box below.